Hi class, we're talking about Luke today, the Gospel of Luke, and first off we're going to start about talking about its relationship with the book of Acts. If you were to read the books through, they're very much a first story, second part of the story type text. First story would be Luke, and it covers the life of Jesus. The second book, Acts, covers the results of his ministry, the disciples going out in different parts of the world and sharing this message. But there's one clear connection between the books there, and it's the inscriptions we find at the beginning of the books. You notice on the left side of the screen there that we have Luke chapter 1, and it talks about this eyewitness, the stories here being handed down, verse 2. Notice if our assumptions about the Luke gospel writer and the book of Acts writer are correct, is that this person was a Gentile, a convert who probably shared a story or received a story from other Christians. And if we go back to the synoptic problem question, may have received oral teachings or some sort of writing, maybe in the form of what we know as the Gospel of Mark today, or even this Q document that's theorized. But this person wasn't an eyewitness, but they heard from eyewitnesses. So verse 3 says, I too decided after investigating everything carefully from the very first to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. Now Theophilus, God lover, is literally what it means. It could be a person, could be kind of a code title, it could be a term of endearment. A lot of translators and a lot of scholars take it as being an actual person's name. That's why you have Theophilus, not God lover, translated in most of the modern translations. But notice over on the right side of the screen, I have the NIRV, the Reader's Edition. Theophilus, I wrote you about Jesus in my earlier book. I wrote about all he did and taught. So we have these two inscriptions of the original and then the sequel, I guess you could say, if you think in movie terms. There's a lot of movie sequels out there today because Hollywood can't come up with good new ideas. Anyway, Luke, or at least this writer, continues the story. So there is this clear connection between Luke. In fact, in scholarship, a lot of times you'll find Luke-Acts listed as a subdiscipline in biblical studies, in New Testament studies especially, Luke-Acts, like a Luke-Acts scholar. And there's other there's other points of parallel language, etc. But this inscription is one concrete connection between the two books. Now, as far as the writing of the book of Luke when it was written, more than likely 70 AD. Most scholars date after 70 AD. There's a passage talking about the siege of Jerusalem, or at least alludes possibly to the siege of Jerusalem in Luke chapter 21, verse 20 and following. And it's written as though someone may be looking back at the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Also, it appears as though Luke may have used the text of Mark. We've already discussed that in previous lectures, talking about the synoptic problem. And so more than likely, if Mark was written early or sometime in the 60s, Luke used it maybe after that, or at least what would become Mark, I should say. Now, as far as the author goes, by the second half or latter half of the 2nd century, church tradition associated Luke and Acts with being a companion of Paul. And we see these we passages in the book of Acts where the pronoun we is used. We went here, we went this, we did this. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about the book of Acts itself. But there's that tradition there. And also the title of Luke is found in several different manuscripts, copies of Luke, I should say, P75, Irenaeus, Muratorian fragment. And Luke is mentioned in the Bible in Philemon 24, Colossians 4:14, 2 Timothy 4:11, Colossians 4:14 suggests that Luke was not Jewish, he was possibly a Gentile. So that's where kind of the tradition comes in, at least the perspective we find in the book of Acts and Luke gives a notion of a Gentile writer. Some have even theorized that this person was skilled as a physician. We don't know specifically, but there's some hints there in the text. Now, there are some problems with the author being a companion of Paul. Acts is theologically and historically different from Paul's epistles, and we'll talk about it again more when we get to Acts, get to Paul. Although for some scholars this comparison, Acts and Paul's epistles, isn't really an issue. People don't always remember things the same as different perspectives, but just something to keep in mind. Just mention it here briefly. Now, what can be derived from the text of Luke? Well, as stated in chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, the author received his knowledge from eyewitnesses. The person wasn't there. And there was this succession of eyewitnesses and traditions that were passed down about Jesus, which doesn't, this notion of passing down of information doesn't make it all that odd that maybe the gospel writer of Matthew and the gospel writer of Mark, etc., received their tradition from somebody else and wasn't necessarily eyewitnesses. And again, they may have been, but more than likely not. As far as the Gospel of Luke goes, the syntax, the grammar of the Greek text is some of the best of the Gospels, whereas Mark is very low grammar and syntax. It's almost like you got a redneck English language Mark, and you got the highfalutin fancy book learning with Luke. And I know it's kind of an odd parallel, but my redneck mind processes that notion that way. In Acts, the author shows knowledge of rhetorical conventions of Greek historians, of Greek literature, Greek philosophy. This person seems to be learned, at least whoever wrote the text was learned. The writer seems to know the Septuagint, the LXX, there's citations of the Septuagint, and uses some Septuagintal stylings of Greek in the books. And the person doesn't appear to know Palestinian geography. There's chapter 4, verses 44 and following, 17:11, seems to be some hints that the person had never been to Palestine, or at least didn't know it well. And also, based on internal evidence of the text, the author was probably a Gentile who became a proselyte, a God-fearer. Now, there were God-fearers were essentially Gentiles who had converted to Judaism, or at least followed Judaism, respected it. They may not have gone all the way with all the conversion, but they weren't born Jewish. They weren't ethnically Jewish, but they did kind of follow. We find several of these people in the text, or at least alluded to in the text of the Bible, New Testament especially. Now, there are a few major themes we find in Luke's Gospel. We find this notion of God's redemptive purpose. It occurs in Luke chapter 7, verse 30. And it also occurs several other times in Acts 2:23, got Acts 13:36, Acts 20:27. And there's three issues that point to this notion of God's sovereignty, or at least God's redemptive purposes. And first off is a notion of God's sovereignty. And this God's sovereignty means that God directs the purposes and events in human history. There are several places where things must happen. Jesus says he must be about his Father's business in chapter 2, verse 49. Jesus must proclaim the kingdom in 4:43. Jesus must suffer and die in chapter 9:22, 17:25, 24:7, and 26. Wars and fighting must occur before the end, 21:9. Scriptures must be fulfilled, 24:44, 22:37. And Jesus must stay at Zacchaeus' house, 19, verse 5. Zacchaeus, the wee little man was he. Also under this notion of sovereignty is Zechariah, Elizabeth, Mary, Jesus, and John the Baptist. All these figures in the Gospel, especially those in the early part of the Gospels, are portrayed as carrying on what God had purposed. There's a purpose to the plan for the reason why Elizabeth is there, etc. And due to God's sovereignty, Scripture must be fulfilled. And this notion is kind of similar to Matthew's Gospel, but all that is written, that phrase is mentioned 3 times. It is written appears over 13 times. There's this continuity with the Old Testament. In fact, 4:21 says, "Today the Scripture has been filled in your hearing." Now, this transitions into another notion here, and another theme in the Gospel of Luke is this notion of salvation for all. And let's look more specifically in the right side of the screen there at this passage in chapter 4, verses 16 through 19. This is the NIV in front of me here. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day went to the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it was written. And this is a quote here, or paraphrase, I should say. "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to the prisoners, and recover the sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And notice the little footnotes there. Well, it should pop up. It should show you. And there's kind of some allusions to Scripture there that where this comes from. But it actually comes from the more so the Septuagint of Isaiah there. This seems to be a rather important theme in the Gospel of Luke, is that just Jesus' purpose for his ministry is to proclaim the good news of the poor, set the prisoners free, recover sight for the blind, and set the free oppressed. There's a notion of Luke where there's inclusion of the outcast of the society, those that are not in the in. Those are outsiders. And there's at least 4 different groups I want to mention to you that seem to be important in this inclusion of those who are lost, those outsiders. First off, we find this group, the sinners. Luke refers to sinners 17 times, more than any other gospel. Sinners are associated with tax collectors, especially in the context of table fellowship. Jesus eating with people who were marginalized by the religious authority. And eating was a very intimate endeavor, very important. In fact, you couldn't eat with certain people because they were ceremonial unclean, or they were sinners, what have you. They're sometimes one and the same. Over in chapter 5, verse 30, when Jesus was criticized for eating with sinners, he responds that he's come not to call the righteous but sinners there. And he says, when the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, why do you eat with tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus answered them, those who are well have no need of a physician. Those who are sick, I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So, and again, you have this notion of inclusion of those who are the outcast society. And I mentioned in a previous lecture, the one on the Jewish context, Second Temple Jewish context, the Am Haaretz, the people of the earth. These were kind of the bulk of the people in Palestine who didn't fall into these religious sects or groups like the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, who weren't quite holy enough for those inner sects, those in crowds, I guess you could say. But also over in chapter 7, verse 34, the Son of Man has come, eating and drinking. You say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And there's a parable of a tax collector and a Pharisee over in chapter 8, verses 9 through 14. And he tells this parable. It says, verse 10 here. 2 people went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee. The one was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed about himself with these words, God, I thank you that I'm not like everyone else, crooks, evildoers, adulterers, or even like the tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of everything I receive. But the tax collector stood at a distance, wouldn't lift his eyes to look toward heaven. Rather, he struck his chest and said, God, show mercy to me, a sinner. I tell you, this person went down to his home justified rather than the Pharisee. All who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up. So this story, this parable, this story of these 2 people is a story that draws a contrast between the religious establishment and those who are outsiders, this tax collector, this reject of the society, who is brought in to the kingdom of God through this inclusion going on here. And notice there's several places in Luke where tax collector is in a positive light. They're portrayed as being included. Now, another important thing about the book of Luke is not just this inclusion of sinners, but this inclusion of Samaritans. So over in Luke chapter 9, verse 51, comes up here. Jesus rebukes his disciples who want to call down a fire on a Samaritan village. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. He sent messengers ahead of him. On their way, they entered a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. Did not receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. When his disciples James and John saw it, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? But he turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. Now, one of the things we find in the text of Luke is this notion is that whereas in the Jewish culture, Samaritans were viewed as being, there is a stigma of being almost like a half-breed. They're ethnically not pure Jewish people, and religiously they're not pure Jewish. See, the Samaritans, there's this notion that they had their roots in the people who were left in the land after the Babylonians took the best and the brightest away, and refer back to the lecture on the history and context. I believe it's lecture 2 there. There are people left in the land. They're Jewish people, but there seems to be this notion of intermixing, interbreeding. Now, there's been a lot of scholarship to explicate who the Samaritans were, but they worshipped on Mount Gerizim as opposed to Mount Zion, where the temple was in Jerusalem. Different temple. They had a different version of the text. They had a Samaritan Pentateuch, or Torah, which was a version. It was very much like the Torah of the the Jewish people of the day, but it was some slight differences, different traditions, some textual traditions going into it. It's not too different, but a little different. So they weren't quite right in most Jewish people's eyes. They were inferior. They were less than perfect. They were outcast, in other words. And oftentimes a Jewish person traveling from Galilee down to Jerusalem would go around a Samaritan land as opposed to going through it, the Samaritan area. Well, Jesus tended to go through it. And we find other places over in Luke's Gospel where Samaritans are important here. And let me get over to that. I'm looking at the Common English Bible. And I'm going to look at, just mention this to you here. There is the story of a Samaritan over in chapter 10 who bandages up a person, takes care of a wounded person on the side of the road. This parable of a Good Samaritan, we'll talk about parables here later in the video here, but essentially there's people who pass by this man who's wounded on the side of the road, who's stripped and left for dead. There's a priest, there's a Levite, they ignore the man. Eventually a Samaritan is a person who comes and bandages him up, fixes him up. Now, think about this, is that the priest and the Levite, they may have not touched him because he may have been ceremonial unclean, because he may be possibly a dead body, so on and so forth. But these people were these Levites and the priests were the insiders. They were the religious insiders in Judaism. They were the in crowd. I think it's in the Cotton Patch version of the Gospel, where Clarence Jordan, a minister in the 50s and 60s in southern Georgia, who translated the Bible from Greek into kind of a colloquial Southern English. He kind of contemporizes things a little bit, and he talks about a preacher and a choir director walking on the side of the road and seeing this guy, and they leave him alone. But the Samaritan, he kind of compares to, in the context of, a racially charged Southern Georgia in the 1950s and 60s, a black man passes by and picks up this white fella and bandages him up, takes him to an inn. So this notion of an outcast inclusion does come to bear in this parable of the Good Samaritan. And over even in chapter 17, verses 11 through 9, we find the 10 lepers who were healed. Only the Samaritan comes back and praises Jesus. Now, and I'm not going to go to the verses here per se and show you those, but I'm going to mention to you also there's inclusion of women. You have inclusion of sinners, inclusion of Samaritans, salvation for sinners, salvation for Samaritans, but also salvation for women. There's an inclusion of women very much so in the text of Luke's Gospel, Luke's version of the telling, or Luke's telling us, I should say, the story of Jesus. We have major female characters such as Elizabeth, Mary's cousin. We have Mary, the mother of Jesus, Anna, the other Mary, and we have Martha as well that take prominent roles in the stories. It's not just the boys' club. It's the women as well. And they seem to take, in some ways, more of a prominent role in Luke's Gospel as compared to other Gospels, at least the other Synoptic Gospels. Over in chapter 7, there's a widow's son who's healed. Jesus vindicates a sinful woman over Simon the Pharisee in chapter 7. Jesus' followers include women and men, chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. Jesus shows dignity and wholeness of a woman, chapter 13, 10 through 17. In 21, 1 through 4, Jesus praises the widow who gives 2 copper coins, the widow's mites. But there's another group, so we had women, Samaritans, sinners, but also the Gentiles are included, at least brought into inclusion in Luke's Gospel more so. And there's examples of this in chapter 7 of Luke's Gospel, we find the centurion and his slave, where Jesus heals them, and that's in Luke 7, 1 through 10. We also find the story of the widow's son at Nain as well, and there's this inclusion. And we'll look in the Gospel, or excuse me, the book of Acts, and we find that there's a very much an outreach to Gentiles in that version, or that sequel, I guess you could say, to Luke's Gospel. Now, we find also in the Gospel of Luke another theme besides salvation for all and God's purposes. We find this notion of emphasis of poverty and wealth that plays a very prominent role in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus preaches as God's vindication of poor and divine judgment upon the rich, in contrast to kind of the popular theology where God blessed the rich. One clear example of that is over in Luke chapter 16. If I can get my handy dandy computer going. Luke chapter 16 verses 19 through 31, we find this talking about, well, did I put down the right chapter? Anyway, talk about this notion of wealth and riches. We also find the story of the rich man Lazarus. Now notice one clear example, and this notion of rich and poor pops up in the Sermon on the Plain. Now remember, in Matthew's Gospel in chapters 5 through 7, we have the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the notion of Jesus going to a mountain to give the new law, the reinterpretation law, very much fits in with Matthew's time with the Old Testament of Moses going up to the mountain receiving the Ten Commandments. But in Luke's Gospel, that emphasis is not necessarily there as far as Jesus being the new Moses. But we do also find some of these teachings. So we find a blessings and woes in Luke chapter 6, which is a part of the Sermon on the Plain. And notice that this version in our NRSV has says, see Matthew 5, 1 through 12, and then so on and so forth. But there's a series of blessings, Beatitudes. We find those in Matthew as well. Blessed are the poor in spirit in Matthew's version. Well, in Luke's, it's blessed are you who are poor, not poor in spirit, poor. There's a spiritualization occurring in Matthew, but in Luke, that is not necessarily there. And there's a playoff of that. Notice down here that the parallel, verse 24, woe to you who are rich. So there's a contrast, poor versus rich. So again, it's not that spiritualization, poor in spirit we find in Matthew, but it's a concrete material notion we find it in Luke. And I don't think that's on purpose. I mean, an accident, excuse me. That's on purpose. Woe to you who are rich. So there's a contrast there. And notice also in there's this concrete notion of inclusion of those who are downcast, those who are hungry now, those who are weep, those who laugh. And there's a contrast with the woe to you who are full now, woe to you who are laughing now. That contrast is not in Matthew's Gospel. Let's hop over to chapter 19, and let's talk about Zacchaeus. And this ties in with wealth. Zacchaeus is a tax collector, and tax collectors often got rich off collecting taxes. And there's some lore that they may have abused the system and collected more than they're supposed to. But Zacchaeus is a rich tax collector who is called down by Jesus while Zacchaeus is up in a sycamore tree, as the old kid song goes, the VBS type song. Zacchaeus pledges to make things right. Chapter 19, verse 8, right there. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. So this notion of giving to the poor is there. And over in chapter 21 of Luke, we find the story of the widow and her mites, her copper coins, her lepton. Looking up, Jesus saw rich people throwing their gifts into the collection box for the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow with 2 small copper coins worth a penny. And she said, I assure you that this poor woman has put more in than all of them. All of them are giving out of their spare change, but she, from her hopeless poverty, has given everything she had to live on. So this, again, that inclusion of the poor, but there's this notion of poverty and wealth going on here. And also over in chapter 14 of Luke, which I won't look at directly, there's this banquet where Jesus tells at least this parable or the story of a banquet where there's the leader, the master tells the servants to invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. And it says, verse 14 says, you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So we talked about themes in Luke. There's salvation for all. There's poverty and wealth. There's this God's purpose. There's also this notion of table fellowship. And we notice that Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners, Pharisees, the crowds of his disciples. We've talked about this a little bit already with some of the inclusion, talked about the sinners, but over in chapter 7, in chapter 9, chapter 11, verses 37 through 52, he has a meal with a Pharisee, and Jesus didn't wash his hands. There's chapter 16, we have the story of the rich man and Lazarus. It deals with table and meal. And even over in chapter 24, the resurrected Jesus has a meal with some disciples on the road to Emmaus, and they don't realize who Jesus is until after the meal type thing. And then we, of course, have the communion, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist in 22. This table fellowship, and here's one commentator, this is looks like Lamar Williamson makes this note. The table fellowship characterizes both the eschatological promise and the experience of the church. In other words, the kingdom is mysterious, but it's us communing together with each other, inclusion of those who are inclusion together, working together, fellowshipping together. And we find over in Acts similar type notions where the disciples had all things in common. They fellowshiped together, they ate together. And eating today, you go out to meals together, right? You have people over the house together. I know some of my favorite times at church are going to meals after church in the fellowship hall, those communal meals, very important. But this table fellowship is important in the Gospel of Luke. So here in a few minutes, we're going to talk about parables. Okay, class, let's talk about parables today. Let's start off by talking about an example and then looking more so at the notion of parables and some history behind the study of parables. But first, let's look at the parable of the sower. It's in Matthew chapter 13, Mark 4, and Luke 8, as well as the Gospel of Thomas. And let me give you a little bit of background on the Gospel of Thomas. There are Gospels that arose out of the era of the Gospel writers and later that did not make into the canon, and there are reasons why. Now, the documents that made it in the New Testament, for the most part, there's a few criteria by which they were kind of let into the canon. I mean, one of them is apostolic origin. Could the document be attributed to a disciple or a student of the disciple to make it to the canon? For example, the Gospel of Matthew was often attributed to Matthew. That's how it made it into canon. Mark was often attributed to Mark, who was a student of Peter, or at least a friend of Peter, made it to the canon. Luke was connected to Paul. The Gospel of, the letter of James connected to James, the brother of Jesus. That's, things like that. Another issue is the notion of recognition by the churches. Did some of the leading churches or more churches use a document? If there are a good number of churches use it versus a smaller number of churches or more prominent churches use it, that helped its inclusion into the canon. And also the notion of content, notion of orthodoxy, the rule of faith. Does what the document teach about Jesus or Christianity or Christian teaching line up with what is known to be right teaching? This rule of faith, not faith as in a belief, but faith as in what one believes. This religion, I guess you could say. Gospel of Thomas was kind of left out mainly because of the rule of faith. It's very much a Gnostic document. Even though it's sayings, there are some of the sayings that are not in the Gospels that are the canonical Gospels that are very Gnostic. It's heresy that emphasizes a very strong duality. It emphasizes special inside knowledge. In fact, we'll talk about this hopefully in the lecture on the other Gospels and historical Jesus. Talk about this notion that one must become male because in order to see salvation. Well, Gnosticism emphasized male as being strong, male as being right. And that does contrast with what one sees in the Gospel, some degree of this Gnosticism we find in Gospel of Thomas. But there are a few passages in Thomas that do line up with the canonical Gospels, and this parable of the sower is part of it. Notice here there's framework in most of these Gospels, and you notice I've got the canonical Gospels on the left side of the screen. There's usually some narrative framework around a lot of these parables, and this narrative framework differs from gospel writer to gospel writer. There's this notion that parables are often used, kind of like the various sayings or events of Jesus' life, to and framed differently so as to fit into the theme of the gospel writer. In other words, a preacher using an illustration differently to get his point across. And the same thing is true with parables to some degree. You got this narrative framework in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Or actually, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and well as Thomas. Thomas doesn't have very much framework because it's mostly sayings. It says, now a sower went out to sow, and he sowed some seeds, and some fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground. I'm reading from Matthew, and you'll notice the parallels light up as I go in the canonical Gospels, where they didn't have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, and since they had no depth of soil, but when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they were withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked at them, and other seeds fell on good soil, and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30. And let anyone with ears listen. Okay? Now notice over in Gospel of Thomas, now sower went out to sow, took a handful of seeds and scattered them on, some fell on the road. The birds came and gathered them up. Others fell on the rocks and did not take root in the soil, did not produce ears. Others fell on thorns, and they choked the seeds, and the worms ate them. Others fell on the good soil and produced good fruit. They bore 60 per measure and 120 per measure. So very similar core sayings that are found across the parables here. But again, the narrative framework is different. Now, what is a parable? Here's a definition that Brandon Bernard Scott gives in his Here Then the Parable. I think it's a really good definition of a parable. And we're going to break it down. A parable is a mashal. It's a Hebrew word, mashal, that employs a short narrative fiction to reference a transcendent symbol. Now, parable as a mashal. Mashal in Hebrew means to be like. And there are characteristics of mashal we find in the Bible. Is the language of mashal is very intensive and memorable, very, using vivid languages to help with retention. This, story of a parable, so going out to sow seeds. You see, as I read this, I see this in my mind, somebody throwing out seeds. Very vivid, it sticks in your memory. Second characteristics of mashal, mashalim, which is a plural mashal. Mashalim are not usually context specific. They can be dropped in different contexts and it's portable to culture. And notice that this parable, the parable of the sower, fits in a different context in the overall greater document of the different Gospels. One thing to keep in mind about this mashal is that Jesus draws from a stock of common images. A lot of these parables are very agrarian, very much geared toward what the average people would understand in their life. And just like cooking a stew, he puts in different ingredients, things that the audience would click with. Things the audience are familiar with. The characters are very stereotyped. So this very memorable, very vivid, connotative language. That's a mashal. There's not a lot of parables, really, maybe one parable or so in the Old Testament, but this mashalim, this notion of intensive, memorable, vivid language, context specific, these comparisons are there in the Old Testament. Like, for example, the phrase "spare the rod, spoil the child." Isn't meant to be taken literally, but can be interpreted different ways depending on the context. Now, going back to the greater definition of parable as a mashal that employs short narrative fiction. Short narrative fiction. Short kind of points to the oral character of a parable. These parables are, short, repetitious. They're meant to be held in your ear, as the rabbinic sources talk about here. Notice these parables have a hook or an element of surprise. There's usually some sort of catch to it, something that catches our attention off the top of the bat there, or the tax collector and the Pharisee. The parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee we looked at in the Gospel of Luke. You expect the Pharisee to be the one who's right with God and righteous, but no, really it's the sinner, the one who repents, the one who turns to God, is the one that is the righteous one in the story. Or even the parable of the Good Samaritan, the hook is that the Samaritan is the one who's the righteous one. So there's an element of surprise. There's not a lot of causation in parables, not a lot of details given. There's additive principle adding on details, but there's not a lot of details in general. There's no answers or cause why. Why is somebody out sowing seed? It's just a short, memorable thing. Now, another notion of this narrative fiction is there's no translation into abstraction. This causes us to translate the parables into our way of thinking. So we think like the Greeks want to think in categories, but this isn't necessarily the case we find in parables. Now, moving on to definition, again, a parable is a mashal that employs short narrative fiction to reference a transcendent symbol. Now, reference is in regards to referencing the unfamiliar with the familiar. There's no theology proper in a parable. Usually that's in the narrative framework, the inclusion and conclusion or intro. But in the actual parable itself, there's hardly any theology. And I said this before in some of the other lectures, essentially parables use everyday stock ideas, motifs, concepts, images to reference things that are not familiar to the people. The kingdom of God, for example, is one that's often mentioned in parables, or God's work in the world. Now, something to think about is allegory. Now, a lot of us maybe look at the parables and notion of allegory. Now, allegory is usually for one thing represents something else. Like when I was in high school, we read The Wizard of Oz in U.S. history class, and we talked about The Wizard of Oz being allegory for the populist movement in the 1800s. The Yellow Brick Road was the gold standard because they wanted to take the country to the gold. From the gold standard to the silver standard, because the slippers are actually supposed to, originally in the book, are silver slippers, not ruby red slippers, and they're off to see the wizard. And, the president of Washington says, it's movement to move the country to the silver standard versus the gold standard. So the representative elements of the story represented actual people in real life. But allegory does that. Allegory takes the unfamiliar to talk about the familiar. Parables is the opposite way around. It takes the familiar to talk about the unfamiliar. And a lot of times we use, thanks to people like Augustine and other medieval thinkers, we tend to think of the parables in allegory. Like if there's a household owner, that's God or that's Jesus. That's not necessarily the case. I think there's meaning in the text of the parable without doing that. You see, like I said, most parables take the familiar to talk about the unfamiliar. And see, you got to watch for the times when the direction of the familiar to the unfamiliar is so jolting that you say it can't be that, so you switch it. But anyway, so back to the definition. Parable is a mashal that employs a short narrative fiction to reference a transcendent symbol. And again, the transcendent symbol most oftentimes in the parables is the notion of the kingdom of God. It's a thing that's unfamiliar to the people that Jesus seeks to illuminate through these parables. Something that's not easily described by people, something that's not easily understood. Now, let's talk about the history of the study of parables. And it's probably going to bore you guys to think about this, but I do want to notice this. Not everybody's looked at parables the same way throughout history. And as I've mentioned, there's notion still is the case where parables are meant to be looked at allegorically, but I think that's kind of taking away some of the teeth of the parable. Modern parable study kind of goes back to the 1880s with a guy named Eulicher, who's a German scholar. A lot of good biblical scholarship has been done in Germany. Prior to Eulicher, parables are almost universally treated as allegory. The parables were deliberately, you know, mysterious, but there's this notion of connecting. Like, for example, if there's a son who's sinned, it's Jesus. If there's a father, that's God. If there's a landowner, it's God. Or a son who disobeys, that's the Jews. Or, you know, this is very problematic because it tethers the text to history. Anyway, but from Irenaeus to Tertullian to Augustine, and even such as Chrysostom, Aquinas, and Calvin, these church leaders and fathers, there was a tension with allegory. You know, Tertullian, Augustine, Irenaeus had looked at allegory. Calvin, Aquinas, and Chrysostom didn't really favor allegory, but for the most part, allegory was the way to look at the text. What's wrong with allegorizing parables? Well, first, there's three things here. First, it obscures the fact that Jesus taught the crowd in parables to aid the crowds in their understanding, not hinder their understanding. Another thing is the details of the story are given undue weight and interpretation. In other words, the nature of parable is to take that which is known to illuminate the lesser known, but the allegory is a restatement, not illumination of the parable. Another thing, third thing, often allegory, the meaning applied is very anachronistic. The interpreting the innkeeper in the parable of the Good Samaritan as Paul that's been known to be done. That's out of time. That's out of place. Why did allegory as an interpretive method flourish? Well, there was the delay of the returning of Christ. Parables became a source of answering why. Church missionary activities over against the Jews, the notion of sowing seed. There's regulations of leadership in the church that kind of emphasize allegory. But Eulicher kind of ushered in a new notion of the study of parables. And not just Eulicher, but also notion looking at the Gospel of Thomas too, which was found, at least the Nag Hammadi version, found later, shows that parable is primary and the allegory is secondary because that the context that we find in the Gospels is different. Anyway, Eulicher believed that parables are simile. This has kind of been changed and discounted. The parables are more metaphor. Eulicher saw the parables as simple, vivid similes, not just stories. Jesus was telling the story of the lives of the Palestinian audience, according to Eulicher. Eulicher, some lasting points from Eulicher, this guy yesterday in modern parable study. Down with allegory. Allegory is not the way to do this. But he also, another point is he talked about a single point methodology. Each parable has a single point of meaning. The highest possible moral generality, a broad ethical maxim. So that's one of the things he talked about. But that kind of, it's one single point may render the parable unnecessary, but there's still, there might be some credence there, but most scholars have discounted this. C.H. Dodd and Jeremias. C.H. Dodd was a British scholar, and Jeremias in the 1930s and 50s. They accepted Eulicher's single point method, but shifted the point away from general moral teachings and moved to the single point to eschatology. C.H. Dodd, which eschatology, remember, is the end of the study of the last things, end times. Dodd believed the parables were, first, eschatological speech, and two, understood them in historical context. The parables are stories describing what happens when God's future comes crashing into the present. So that's one of those type of things. Now, there ended up being another change in thought after, people like Dodd and his eschatology, or Jeremias and his trying to reconstruct the Sitz im Leben of Jesus when he spoke the parables, what setting Jesus tried to tell these parables in. The new hermeneutic comes along later, and this German movement in the 60s was a response to Rudolf Bultmann, a German scholar. And this movement scholars try to emphasize the language. To them, language is an expression of life, not just a means of transferring detail. They talk about a language event. That Jesus' understanding of reality enters language in a new way. For the task of someone to teach or preach parables is to make language accessible. And this kind of was picked up in this newer study of parables, especially in American literary approaches. And this a lot rests on the shoulders of a German lady named Etta Linnemann. She said the single greatest weakness of scholarship from Muhlenberg to the 1970s, except for Linnemann, was to treat the parables as literary creations. Literary criticism seized upon this, and the Center of Parable Studies, Center from Germany to the U.S. Anyway, I'm looking at my notes here, and I'm a little distraught here, but I got too much detail. But anyway, one of my professors in divinity school, Danny Goodman, who's since passed on to be with the Lord, gave this illustration this way. It's like looking at a painting and it moving you without looking at the card. And if you've ever been to the Beckler Museum in Charlotte, Museum of Modern Art in Charlotte, my wife and I went there, and my wife, she's just not really an art person, and she doesn't really get it, especially modern art, and tried to tell her sometimes art or text in this kind of a postmodern Tell-Kell group way of looking at text. Text doesn't have to be printed words. It can be, world stories. It can be a drawing and a piece of art. But anyway, text can mean things, or not necessarily just mean things, but text can do things. Modern art, some of these paintings we saw at the Beckler, just rather abstractions, but it's not so much what it means as much as what does it make you feel, what does it make you do. So Goodman's, again, his illustration was that a painting can move you without looking at the card. The parable should evoke something from you. And notion that parable's meaning is self-contained. That's one of the mantras in this new American parable study. It's very literary, literarily connected. You don't jump outside the parable to find meaning. In other words, you don't jump to Christian theology to find meaning of the parable. And parable studies don't tend to look at the framework and find meaning for the parable in the framework, but look at the framework. Look at the parable itself. Yeah, that's kind of where American Parable Study stands. But these stories are, I think, one of the takeaways, at least for contemporary Christians, for the parables, tends to be this notion is that we need to look at the parables and notice that they're not allegory. Need to notice that they're catches, they're hooks that are meant to throw us and surprise us. One of my convictions in life is that, this is the preacher talking here, is that God isn't always what we expect or acts how we expect it, or even chooses people to work for him or follow him that we expect. And the parables seem to get us with those little hooks. And again, the Gospel of Luke I love it because there's this notion of those who are outsiders are the ones that are the hooks. They're the ones that are literally hooks. They catch us, like the Good Samaritan in the parable, the tax collector and the sinner, but there's these hooks in these stories that we need to pay attention to. But anyway, those are parables, using stories that use use everyday images and notions, vivid images, to try to talk about a transcendent reality such as the kingdom of God. That's parables. So there you go. Cheers.